recent report has revealed how dire the state of South African municipalities is. It revealed that a third of the country's 257 municipalities were in severe financial distress, with 43 of them qualifying to fall under administration under the Constitution. While the numbers may sound interesting, it is the impact on residents and ratepayers that most often goes unquantified. Joining us now to discuss the urgent intervention that can be taken to avoid total economic collapse in distressed municipalities is South African Cities Network Program Manager for Well-Governed City, Danga Mughogho. Danga, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. The DG at Treasury saying that of the 257 municipalities in the country, about 170 are in financial distress. Your own report says 1 in 5 people in Joburg and Cape Town live in informal housing. That's what your report says. Is there a correlation between what Treasury is reporting and what you have found in your report?
Thank you for having me, and good to your listeners. There is a correlation, but maybe I should say at a very high level. What we focus on at the South African Cities Network, we focus on the metros and Sunduzi, so the bigger cities in the country. And the report which came out today and has been widely reported, and of course it is in fact shocking, but I think it would be fair to say that the situation we see in the metros is not the same as we see in many of the failing municipalities that are pointed out in that report. It's worth pointing out that metros, from a financial perspective, are definitely not in the same sort of situation that many of those municipalities are pointed out in the report as being, which is where they find themselves unable to provide basic services to the residents within their areas, as well as to meet some of the more ambitious policy goals that we have in our urban policy.
Yeah. So what would be the explanation then for what you are seeing? There are more people in informal settings in metros like the metro in Johannesburg and the metro in Cape Town than what you would find, for example, in the Eastern Cape.
Yes, no, that is a good question. Indeed, informality as well as urbanization have been the overwhelming trends that we see over the past 10, 20 years or so since 1994. And clearly what is happening is that people are coming into cities, as they do around the world, in search of opportunities. So people come from rural areas, they come from smaller cities to the big cities, the metros that we see this influx into. And typically when people come, they are coming in search of opportunities, so they don't necessarily have a lot when they arrive. And very often they'll settle, therefore, in informal settlements where they are able to settle. The challenge really, from a city perspective, is that those informal settlements may not necessarily be planned. So one of the things that cities do is they provide bulk infrastructure, which is the infrastructure that allows for electricity, for water to be provided to residents. And you can imagine if an informal settlement springs up in a particular area where that planning had not taken place, then clearly the informal settlement finds itself in a situation where it doesn't necessarily have those basic services to begin with. The other thing that's worth pointing out, though, is to say that this is not something, and we have a tension with informality. I think we should also be aware that people are coming in search of opportunity, and informality is not necessarily a blight on the landscape, as very often some commentators will point it out. People naturally come to a place where they're close to the city and where it makes sense. So, for example, historically, people would have come to Alexandra and settled because Sandton is close by and there are opportunities and jobs there. So the challenge really is to say, how do we capacitate cities? How do we provide them, or how do cities get enough finances in order to be able to upgrade those informal settlements? And there is, in fact, money that comes from National Treasury for that purpose. But it still is an ongoing challenge, and that is why we continue to see informality in our cities.
Yeah. Informality you're seeing in big cities, but you're saying, for example, Nelson Mandela Bay, which was also under the microscope in this report, had the smallest percentage of people in informal housing, 6.1% of its 1.2 million residents, but the highest level of unemployment in 2020. To what do you attribute that?
Well, that's a good question. I knew the answer to that, then perhaps I would be president. I think, urban areas and cities have unique contexts and face unique challenges within them. So to say, we can not necessarily draw a direct comparison necessarily to what's happening in Nelson Mandela Bay to what's happening in Tshwane, for example. Having said that, also the hinterland and maybe the demands, the size of the population who are looking for opportunities may be different, for different cities. Also, post-demarcation in 2000, the municipal demarcation that took place, there are certain cities which were demarcated in such a way that they have a very large hinterland. So Tshwane, I think, is one of those. Also, Mangaung, for example, has large borders within which there are areas which are almost rural in some cases. And that then also has an impact on what patterns you see in terms of settlement patterns, how much informality there is. But also, I think it's worth pointing out that the unemployment rate is very much tied to the opportunities that exist in the city, number one, but also the general economy, the state of the economy. And as we know, since 2008 or so, the economy has not been growing at the rate that we would like to see in order for jobs to be created. And the impact of that joblessness, of the lack of job, precisely to the opportunities.
Yeah. There are two cities, you say, that have focused on the local economic development, including city-facilitated employment. And in your report, you're saying these two cities have seen the most stability in terms of politics, as well as in terms of investor confidence. To what degree?
Thank you for that point. And in fact, the report that was coming out of Treasury as well, the comments coming from Treasury, the Director General, were pointing out to the importance of political stability in our municipalities. It doesn't matter what the size of the municipality may be, that if there's stability within the political realm in that municipality, the chances are that the administration, or the people who sit in the municipal building and actually do the work, are able to do their jobs with less interference. Once you get political instability, it tends to have a knock-on effect within the administration, and that results in delays, for example, in budgeting processes, delays in supply chain management processes, which are the way in which the city does its work. So you would have to commission an engineer to fix infrastructure, for example, to construct new infrastructure. And where there's political instability, there's political bickering, as we saw in the coalition government since 2016, so it tends to have a knock-on effect in terms of the delivery of services to the residents of that municipality.
Yeah, we're having a challenge there with that connection, but let's see if it will hold. But share your thoughts then on what you mean by the private sector playing a much larger or bigger role more than government when it comes to urban settlement.
Yes, well, that is something that we do point out in our report. And one of the visions, or one of the goals of developmental local government, as the local government white paper stated in 1998, was that while, of course, the state is tasked with basic service delivery and providing free basic services to those members of the population who are not able to have those services, on the other hand, the thinking was very clear that government can't do everything. So government can, to a certain extent, provide for the indigent and those who are not able to afford services, but also, most importantly, in terms of job creation. Government doesn't actually create jobs. The thinking is that government creates an enabling environment within which the private sector can flourish and hire people, but also that entrepreneurs are able to start businesses of whatever size, whatever scale, and also employ people within the municipal boundaries. And so in our report, we focused on what we call the all-of-society approach. And we looked at the extent to which this approach, by which government provides this enabling environment, engages with the private sector around their needs and what would make for a conducive environment for businesses I've just described to take place. And we find that, with exceptions here and there, but in the main, there are some deficits in this all-of-society approach, and particularly in some cases even an antagonistic relationship between the private sector and the state, which we see also in national government discussions as well. So we emphasize that it's actually critically important for there to be good engagement between municipalities and the private sector and civil society, and indeed all urban stakeholders in order to achieve the developmental outcomes that we envision in our urban policies.
All right, Danga Mughogho, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on. Program Manager there at South African Cities Network, looking at what private sector role would be, but also the state of the metros in the country and what the challenges that they face are.